And thank you for listening and watching this presentation. I'm going to talk to you today about the historical and contemporary roles of ombuds institutions. So this is what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to give you an overview of the origin and global spread of the Ombudsman Institution. I'm going to talk about the reasons for the diffusion of the Ombud idea throughout the world. And then I'm going to talk about the models, roles, and expectations of the Ombud Institution today. So, as is well known, the modern Ombudsman Institution has its roots in the creation of the Swedish Ombudsman in 1809. The word itself is interesting and derives from Old Norse and the idea that the Ombudsman is a commissioner and an agent. Some commentators have questioned whether the term ombudsman is comprehensible to ordinary citizens and whether it really remains appropriate in the modern world. And in this context, it's interesting to note that Professor Victor Ayeni, who's the world's leading scholar on the Ombudsman Institution in Africa, has noted that the formal use of the Ombuds title in Africa is actually not that common. Notwithstanding, I think the term ombud or ombudsman is still a useful way of describing the global family of institutions that are involved in this particular type of non-judicial independent grievance handling. The Swedish ombudsman has been referred to as conforming to a rule of law ombuds model as a result of the fact that its remit is concerned primarily with legality. It has strong powers to prosecute government officials, and it even has a jurisdiction over the judiciary. And as we'll see, the models that expanded globally have been somewhat different. So although the modern history of the Ombudsman can be traced back to Sweden in 1809, the idea of non-judicial independent grievance handling is a rather older one. Precursors have been suggested in China, India, and Pakistan. In Africa, Professor Ayeni has highlighted a number of potential precursors. In the Sokoto Caliphate, the Wali was appointed as an incumbent of the office of the Waliyatil Wazalim to receive and resolve public complaints against individuals in authority. The constitution of the Hausa states, meanwhile, specifically provided for the establishment of so-called public complaints authorities or mutasib throughout the kingdom. And in other pre-colonial settings, ombudsman-like roles were ascribed to the overall head of the community. So in parts of West Africa, obas or emirs could be contacted with complaints. The Oba of Benin in Western Nigeria continues to hold regular sessions in his palace to receive complaints from his subjects. So it's important to recognize that in certain contexts, pre-existing national traditions can be identified as connected to the modern ombud idea. And I think this is an important corrective to the Western-centric notion that independent complaint resolution was primarily a Western invention. So they say a picture paints 1,000 words, and as I hope you can see from this slide, the basic story of the Ombudsman's institution globally has been one of massive expansion since the 1950s. From being only 2 offices prior to 1954, only 60 years later, there were over 160. So for the next 5 slides, I would like to acknowledge the contribution of my colleague Eric Drake, former Deputy Ombudsman in the Office of the Scottish Public Service Ombudsman, who created these images as part of a training programme developed by Queen Margaret University. So ombuds have been around in their modern form for around 215 years, but for 150 of those years, ombuds were a more or less exclusively Nordic institution. 110 years after the Swedish Ombuds was created, Finland created the world's second ombudsman in 1919. In the 1950s and 1960s, we see 2 trends. The first is the expansion of the Ombud institution within Scandinavia, with Denmark and Norway establishing offices. And the second is the adoption of the Ombud institution in Commonwealth and newly independent post-colonial nations, such as Guyana and Tanzania. And I think there are 2 landmarks worth remarking on in this period. The first is the creation of the Danish Ombudsman's Office in 1954, which involved the development of a more flexible model with soft law powers of recommendation and reporting and no jurisdiction over the judiciary. And this more flexible approach, which is often now called the classical model, is seen as one of the key developments that allowed the expansion of the Ombud outward of Scandinavia. The second landmark is the creation of the Ombud in Tanzania in 1966. This was the first Ombud office in Africa and the sixth Ombud to be created worldwide. It's also the earliest example we have of an Ombud being set up as part of constitution-building efforts following the demise of repressive, imperial, and authoritarian regimes, which, as we'll see, is a trend that continued thereafter. In the next decade, we see further expansion of the institution within Commonwealth and post-colonial settings, as well as growth within Europe. And so overall, this period between the sort of late 70s and the end of the century was characterized by movements involving democratization, public institution building, and comparative law influences. There was also an increasing emphasis placed on human rights as a focus of the Ombudsman. Newly independent countries in the developing world, in Ibero-American countries, in former member states of the Eastern Bloc, all created ombuds in this period who had a particular focus on human rights. In Africa, in Africa, Professor Ayeni has referred to the 1990s as the decade of the Ombudsman in Africa, as it saw more than 40 offices being established. Now, this chart may not be comprehensive, and it's also some 10 years out of date, but it just gives you a sense of where we are today. The global expansion of the institution is such that few countries around the world do not have an ombudsman institution at all. And it's not surprising that as a result of this, the Ombuds is often seen as one of the world's most successful legal transplants. So the question that arises is, why was the Ombudsman, why did the Ombudsman spread in this way? And there are four broad reasons that have been suggested in the literature. The first is that it's a response to the growth in government activities, so especially in established democracies, growth of public administration, much wider range of activities being taken on as a responsibility of the state, and as a result, consequent need for citizens to be able to challenge decisions being made that affect their daily lives. There was also a perception that the courts were unable to provide accessible justice, and the Ombudsman was seen as a solution to this. I've already spoken about the fact that the Ombudsman has been often there to respond, or as part of responses to systemic upheaval or crisis. So decolonization, regime changes, processes of democratization and constitution building. Ombudsmen have been seen as a kind of key movement in moving away from repressive and illiberal regimes towards ones based on democracy and the rule of law. The influence of policy advocates is something that's very interesting and has been discussed quite a bit in the literature. So, for example, Professor Hurwitz, who was the first Danish ombudsman, was a very able and charismatic proponent of the Ombudsman institution, and he went around the world promoting the idea in various states, and he was seen as very influential, for example, in the creation of the Ombudsman in New Zealand in 1962. And finally, international organizations have been very influential in terms of norm setting and in terms of setting expectations that countries within their jurisdiction would have access to an ombudsman. So, in terms of waves of development, the literature has identified kind of four broad waves and, I suppose, models to which ombuds around the world have tended to conform. The first generation of ombuds is referred to as rule of law ombuds, and I mentioned at the start that the Swedish ombudsman is often referred to in this way. The Finnish ombudsman, which is a very similar model to the Swedish ombudsman, also fits within this category. So the focus here is very much on legality, powers to prosecute civil servants and public servants, and a jurisdiction over the judiciary. The second generation of ombuds is the ombuds that is classically associated with Denmark. So this is an ombuds which is focused on extra-legal ideas of maladministration rather than the sole focus on legality. And its powers are much more around reporting and recommendation rather than, for example, prosecuting individual public servants. The third generation of ombuds are the human rights ombuds. So, as the name suggests, very much focused on human rights and often in the context of newly emergent or fragile democracies. But this trend has actually become a wider trend now, such that ombuds around the world who perhaps originally had that classical jurisdiction of maladministration are also very much working in the human rights space. And finally, a fourth generation of ombuds is suggested by Remak, who I'm citing here. And this is a model that often isn't talked about that much, but he says is strongly associated with the developing world, where the emphasis of the ombuds is on anti-corruption. Now, although these waves can be identified as to some extent distinct waves that have happened over time, on the other hand, there's a process which is referred to in the literature as hybridization, where a lot of these models are kind of coming together and converging. So even ombuds, for example, that started off as classical ombudsman might now be taking on a substantial human rights mandate, and ombuds who primarily are looking at anti-corruption might also be looking at maladministration and human rights. So just because an ombudsman was created along a certain type of model doesn't mean that that's where they stay today. So I want to talk about some more kind of, I suppose, conceptual models of the Ombudsman institution now, which relates to what their activities either are or should be, and also tells us something about the expectations of the Ombudsman in the modern world. So Harlow and Rawlings, who are administrative lawyers from the UK, have come up with a very famous metaphor for suggesting the different roles that the Ombudsman might play within the state. So they talk about the Ombuds either being a firefighter or a fire watcher. A firefighter ombudsman is an ombud that is very much focused on individual complaints and on sorting out individual problems when complainants raise an issue with the office. A fire watcher ombudsman, on the other hand, is less concerned with individual redress and becoming, for example, a small claims court for hundreds of thousands of cases. And here the ombudsman's role is seen much more as one which scans the horizons of public administration and looks for strategic points at which to intervene in order to basically have a big impact on lots of people. So the fire watcher ombudsman doesn't see its job necessarily as providing redress in every single case. It's much more about identifying major failures in public administration that really deserve, I suppose, or require the Ombudsman's intervention. A third model has been added by Rick Snell, who's an Australian academic who talked about fire prevention as a model. And here the idea is that the Ombudsman shouldn't just be either reacting to individual complaints or more proactively looking for big cases which have potential to transform public administration, but actually should be trying to stop issues arising and problems arising in public administration in the first place. So this is, for example, through issuing guidance or providing almost consultancy services, if you like, to organizations, advice, guidance, and trying to get ahead of complaints to make sure that problems don't arise. Anita Stump, who's another academic from Australia, has suggested three models: a reactive model, a variegated model, and a proactive model. And as the name suggests, again, these models are very much around whether there is a response to the individual complaint or there's an attempt at around sort of generating and prompting systemic change. But one of the interesting things about Anita Stump's models is that the variegated and proactive forms often don't involve just simply having a more proactive approach, but actually involve having much more different types of roles coming together. So, for example, being given additional powers around inspection or audit. And that's another, I think, major theme in the development of ombuds institutions around the world, is that quite often ombudsmen are given additional functions, whether that's to be a national human rights institution, whether that's to have certain inspection requirements, or whether it's a collection of roles that fall within the brackets of oversight, but aren't necessarily classically associated with the ombudsman. Sharon Gillard has suggested that expectations management is a growing aspect of what ombudsmen are there to do. So, of course, where ombudsmen uphold complaints and find fault, they recommend change and they suggest improvements in public administration, but quite often ombudsmen are not doing that. They only do that in a proportion of cases. In a lot of cases, ombudsmen are not upholding complaints, And their role there is to try and explain to the citizen why the public authority has acted correctly. And expectations management is seen as a process whereby trust and legitimacy of public authority can be kind of restored in the idea, in the minds of citizens who've experienced a problem, who are unhappy about it, and who feel that they haven't been treated well, but at the same time, the Ombudsman is disagreeing with them. So it's trying to bridge that kind of gap and make sure that these individuals understand why their complaint isn't being upheld, but also have a renewed trust, I suppose, in public authority, where that public authority has in fact been exercised legitimately. I've written a bit about how the Ombudsman is becoming an increasingly managerial actor. So, for example, in the UK context, Ombudsmen are trying to take on a role almost kind of regulating complaints procedures within public bodies. So again, this is about trying to go a little bit further than simply responding to complaints. They're also providing quite bespoke consultancy services sometimes to public organizations. And finally, an important trend is an increased focus on access to justice for vulnerable people. So originally, the Ombudsman was very much seen as an institution that would have a special role in relation to particularly vulnerable individuals and groups, because unlike courts and other institutions, the Ombudsman might be more accessible. It's not always clear over time that the Ombudsman has managed in all settings to fulfill that function and to be truly accessible to those who need it most. So certainly one of the sort of expectations or growing expectations is that the Ombudsman should have that as a predominant focus of its work. So let me just conclude then with just a few points. The Ombudsman, as I hope I have suggested, is one of the world's most successful legal transplants, as well as having some precursors in various national and cultural contexts. The growth in government, the growth in the Ombudsman institution around the world can be explained in a number of ways, whether that's growth in government, the fact that courts are inaccessible, or whether it's through constitution building efforts. There are various ways in which we can understand how these developments have occurred. And in terms of sort of three overall trends in the historical development, well, I think the first trend is the softening of the rule of law model, which allowed, I think, for the Ombudsman to expand out with Scandinavia, and also was the first step in allowing it to adapt to different legal, constitutional, and cultural contexts. The growth of human rights as either an explicit or an implicit focus, I think, is a major story of the modern Ombuds institution, and that's been driven both by national and international pressures. And finally, a diversification in Ombudsman functions, whether that's in terms of the remit or the nature of activities, Ombudsman becoming more proactive, but also being given a wider range of tasks within the state. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. You have some references here that can be followed up for anyone who would like more information. My name is Professor Chris Gill, and I'm at the University of Glasgow. If you have any questions for me, I'm more than happy to take them. Please contact me directly, or you can contact me through the African Ombudsman Research Centre, who will be happy to pass on your queries. Thank you.
I welcome the invitation by the African Ombudsman Research Centre and wish to express my gratitude to them for inviting me to do a presentation. My presentation is divided in 5 parts. It starts with an introduction and ends with a conclusion. I was asked to make a presentation on challenges and achievements for Ombudsman officers, examining the common challenges faced by Ombudsman officers and highlighting notable successes and best practices. Introduction. In a landmark judgment, the former Chief Justice of South Africa, Justice Mogoeng, said the following, and I quote, "The public protector is critical and indeed indispensable factor in the facilitation of good governance and keeping our constitutional democracy strong and vibrant," unquote. I fully agree with these sentiments expressed by the former Chief Justice, and I wish to add that no democracy can function without an ombudsman. That is, for me, is the hallmark of the institution's importance. The very name ombudsman, mediator, public protector, providoria de justicia, or defensor del pueblo, creates expectations. An expectation of not just service, but effective and efficient service. For Richard Carver, effectiveness, and I quote, is ultimately how far the ombudsman facilitates the enjoyment of the rights of the public, whether as citizens or simply as human beings. For him, efficiency is about how well the Ombudsman institution does the things it does, not whether these things are the best things or for it to be doing, unquote. Safeguarding individual freedoms, checking abuses by public officials, abuses of power by law enforcement officers, and preventing basic fairness in government-citizen interaction are the services that citizens expect of the Ombudsman. When the citizen comes in contact with a public service, it is the citizen who must be served. The citizen comes first. Common challenges. First, relevancy. If it is accepted that to be effective, the Ombudsman must be relevant to the government which established it and to the citizens whose complaints it receives. It must not only reaffirm but also reassess its powers and adapt its actions to current expectations. Its relevancy will be measured by the extent to which it is responsive to those who encountered unfairness, abuse, deprivation of dignity, and violation of their rights. If institutions are to remain relevant, they must indeed be open to changes and challenges. Flexibility and adaptation are necessary to meet today's changing needs of citizens. What today's changing needs are depend on the current conditions of each country and of each ombudsman office. Credibility. To be effective, the ombudsman must also enjoy a high degree of credibility. To achieve a credibility, the ombudsman must be perceived to be effective. The system of complaint handling must be devised in such a way to encourage public confidence while protecting public officials from false accusations and suspicions. Standard of performance and integrity. The Ombudsman must ensure that they attain the highest possible standards of performance without bias and with complete integrity. Their integrity and credibility must be beyond reproach. These are the pillars of the Ombudsman authority. They must establish and sustain that authority by the way they perform their actions and functions. Improving collaboration. Events, conferences, and meetings are excellent strategies for collaborations. These are the opportunity where Ombudsman, National Human Rights Institution, civil society, and Parliament can share hard-earned knowledge gained by experience over many years. The Ombudsman should develop and conduct outreach activities in collaboration with National Human Rights Institution and civil society.
At the challenges and the evolution that the Ombuds institution has gone through, but also important to be very practical in terms of where we are at now and how we use the present to inform the future. So it is in that light that I make this presentation. My outline, I hope you can all see my screen. I'll start with an introduction and then identify a few key advocacy areas that we might be focusing on based on the diversity of our mandates, and then the methodologies at our disposal and what we need to put in place as key success factors, and then the future trends for advocacy in Ombuds institutions. By way of introduction, this has already been tackled by Advocate Waters and Professor Jill, who spoke earlier, looking at the evolution of Ombuds institutions, our historic background, where we're primarily handling complaints and basically being the advocates for people that were oppressed against the powerful. So there's been a number of definitions for the Ombuds institutions, including EA for the people, representing and defending the rights and interests of others, and advancing a certain idea, practice, or conduct. And it is on this on which I would like to premise our interrogation today of our role as institutions that are engaged in advocacy. It has already been said that over time, our mandates have diversified in terms of the issues that we have oversight over, the modus operandi for the different Ombuds institutions. But one thing I think still underlies our work, which is that we basically advocate for the less privileged, the marginalized, and those people that do not have voices. In that regard, we have a number of key advocacy areas based on the different mandates that we have. Primarily, I think we all focus on issues of maladministration. And therefore, when we become advocacy institutions in these areas, we are basically looking at the way public administrators are discharging their mandates and whether there is good administrative practices in place, issues of procedural compliance,
procedimento, conformidade. Tivemos alguns problemas de som,
policy reforms,
relatórios policiais,
whether there's been reasonableness, fairness, and responsiveness in service delivery. And in a practical way, I'm going to illustrate this. Can I just ask one of the interpreters to please mute their microphone? I think they're interfering with the presentation, if that's okay. Honorable Vusumuzi, can you help me with that? Oh, are they muted now?
Vai mostrar-nos.
Thank you, Honorable Malera. I am not sure what is going on, but can somebody really, Antonio Jose, Jose, please mute? You are disturbing the speaker, sir.
Antonio. We have assigned it. It was not assigned before. It should be fine now.
Okay. Thank you so much. So in that area of maladministration, I will illustrate by way of a practical example how, as Malawi Ombudsman Office, we are carrying on systemic investigations on a number of issues to actually influence public policy reforms and addressing the structural issues that underlie the manifestations of these maladministration practices that we see. Advocate Waters already talked about need to mainstream human rights into our work. Basically, we also, as we handle issues of maladministration, we basically are also handling issues of human rights violations. And to this end, in the Malawi Ombudsman, I was giving an example there of how we investigated and did a public inquiry on a case where 194 ex-Malawi Army soldiers did not receive their appropriate dues for the period 2004 to 2012. They registered a complaint with the Ombudsman Office. We handled that complaint. And by 2023, we played a mediatory role with the relevant offices, the Secretary to Treasury, the Accountant General, and other players. And these ex-soldiers finally received their payment. They could not have access to the courts because of issues of statute of limitations, access to information, and so on and so forth. Our other key advocacy area, depending on our mandates as access to information, would then be issues around transparency and accountability and access to information. And in this regard, as an office, we are doing a lot of work on investigations into recruitment processes for public offices, where some of them do not follow procedures. Some of them are based on nepotistic tendencies and things of that nature. Then we also play a role in access to justice, where we're looking at issues of rule of law and accountability. So these are the key advocacy areas that we must be grounded on for now and going into the future. I am just illustrating by way of practical examples. This is a systemic investigation whose report we issued in February this year on the Affordable Inputs Program implementation by the Malawi government that is marred by irregularities and a number of failures. So we titled it A Call for Rethinking and Reprogramming, essentially going beyond the day-to-day complaints handling of the various beneficiaries under this program, but to then address the systemic issues, the structural issues, and already beginning to inform policy reforms. So in that systemic investigation, for example, we called for government to undertake a forensic audit on the implementation of this program because of a lot of misappropriation of finances, where they're supposed to buy fertilizer, but they won't buy the prescribed amounts, but the appropriate monies will have been spent anyway, and so on and so forth. We engaged the media a lot in that process, and those are some of the media cuttings where we kept this issue consistently on the agenda. And this was a meeting that we had with the relevant parliamentary committee of parliament to make sure that we are bringing advocacy through relevant arms of government, including parliament. We also did another systemic investigation in 2023 amid the COVID crisis, where I think for every crisis, there's opportunity for unscrupulous individuals to mismanage or misappropriate the funds meant for alleviating the plight of the poor or those that are suffering. So amidst COVID-19, we carried out and we called for effective, efficient, and accountable public resource management and carried out a systemic investigation on COVID-19 response. This was also part of our advocacy, and as can be seen in this cutting, we're able to influence recovery of ineligible allowances that were paid out to public officials on the pretext of COVID work. So this is one of our councils that was able to recover a lot of money in Malawian kwacha terms, but also in USD terms for people that had received ineligible COVID allowances. Stakeholder engagement remains imperative for us for now and the future. So all the work that we did on the Affordable Input Farm program, where there was a lot of stakeholder engagement, this is the team from the Ombudsman that had gone to engage with the Minister of Agriculture. I think one of the key learnings in terms of advocacy is that we must be collaborative and not unduly antagonistic in our work. So we collaborated with government, and it was easy for them to adopt and start implementing our recommendations. On access to information, transparency, and accountability, the advocacy space will continue to see the Ombudsman increasingly playing a role for demanding open civic space and open government. I think if we miss these critical ingredients, we will continue handling the individual complaints that we receive on a day-to-day basis without really getting to the gist of the issues and therefore advocating around them. We also carried out a lot of investigations to ensure that there's access to information and that there's a lot of no and procedural and irregular and unlawful recruitment. So this is where the Ombudsman is quoted as questioning the dubious recruitments in the government offices. And one particular instance is where we are investigating currently the recruitment process for foreign officers. These are officers to be dispatched to various Malawi embassies, the allegations around nepotism on those recruitments. So in our advocacy around access to information, this kind of work is also important. I'll now briefly speak on what methodologies we have at our disposal for ensuring that we are matching our work on day-to-day individual complaints handling, but also building into it our roles as institutions of advocacy, representing the voiceless and the invisible in our societies. So probably all of us have got complaints resolution as one of the key methodologies. This is our core mandate. In that, we are emphasizing the role for tripartite meetings, dialogues, and engagement, and playing a mediatory role. Our lesson is that once you lose out on the opportunity for dialoguing and mediatory role, you are left with inquiry. And in an inquiry, what you come up with are basically directives, which becomes tricky when it comes to enforcement. But when you utilize tripartite meetings, dialogues, there's room for dissecting the issues and getting the government to buy into what is it that, to identify where they did things wrong and to actually acknowledge and want to perfect or to right or to remedy the situation. So using that methodology, for example, is where we were able to settle the long-standing issue of the ex-soldiers that were not paid their dues. We're also saying another methodology, the classical one, is the investigative mandate that we have and the inquiries that we provide. But inbuilt into those processes should be more of collaborative approaches to enable people understand the principles that we're trying to advance: accountability, transparency, and why this must be enforced. Then we have systemic investigations. Increasingly, this is becoming a very critical tool for influencing policy reforms, for influencing programmatic reforms, etc., etc. And I've just outlined a number of systemic investigations that we have carried out, particularly for areas that are hardly given attention to. So some of our key examples, for example, are systemic investigations that we have done in issues of mental institutions. One of our reports called Out of Sight, Out of Mind, where we looked at the situation in our mental hospitals in Malawi. There must be also strategic dissemination of our investigation reports. So for us, for every systemic investigation of public interest, we actually disseminate that through press briefings. We actually have the media so that they can pick the agenda and run with them long after we have produced our reports, but also to ensure that that agenda stays consistently in the public discourse, and that beyond ourselves as an office, the media partners with us to ensure that they are oversighting on compliance. We also need to keep targeting issues of public interest through systemic investigations, as I've said. For institutions like Malawi Ombudsman, where we have advisory mandate to provide advisory opinions, that is also a critical avenue for our advocacy work. Then there's also the critical role of public awareness. We need to engage the citizenry to participate in our processes. And in this regard, for the Malawi Ombudsman, we carry out what we call mobile accountability clinics and the use of community radios. This is very important for advocacy at the local levels. In one sitting in a district, you can actually achieve more than operating centrally. There's a question that came through email to say, for ombudsmen that are centrally located, how do you reach out with advocacy roles to the entire breadth and length of the country? So mobile accountability clinics is one of such important avenues. I already emphasized the point of cultivating good synergistic working relationships with all stakeholders, particularly ministries, departments and agencies, parliament, civil society and the media, as well as other oversight institutions. We cannot do, as we share these mandates with, for example, rights institutions. So to what extent are we collaborating in our advocacy efforts? Publication of our administrative justice and status reports, and utilization of ICT. So this is just it is at district level, to engage and mobilize civic participation through community radios. This is the work that we did in one district called Zomba, and this is a piece of work that we did in another district by using community radios and actually mobilizing communities to demand accountability from central and local government through radio programs, and using that to package all that information and channel it to the relevant government offices. What success factors do we need to put in place to ensure that we become more relevant, more effective in our advocacy work? Number one, I think this has already been emphasized, is for us to ensure that we discharge our mandate in accordance to the key principles over which our mandates are based, which are independence. The facilitator has already emphasized the need for us to be seen as completely independent, and independent from government, independent from political influence, independent from our own biases that we can bring to this work. I don't know, the day you have an LGBT person coming for protection from the ombudsman, how do you deal with some of our personal biases around these kind of issues? Impartiality, fairness, objectivity, and transparency. These are our key success factors. Due diligence, this has already been emphasized in our investigations, making sure that we almost leave, or wherever practicable, we do not leave any stone unturned, so that our findings, the integrity of our processes is protected, but also the credibility of our findings and our reports is ensured. Quality reports and well-designed and prepared and executed monitoring and outreach and public awareness activities. These are all our critical success factors. How do we move into the future? Number one is to leverage on our classical persuasion mandates. People have asked, last year we were amending the Malawi Ombudsman Act, and the question was whether we should be given powers like the courts when it comes to our directives. The general consensus by all stakeholders that we consulted was the day we are given legally enforceable mandates like the courts, we just metamorphose ourselves into another court, another arm of the judiciary, inherent with all the challenges that besiege the judiciary. So the consensus was leave the ombudsman the way it is and maybe strengthen how the directives or recommendations from the institution can be implemented. More ombudsman should be given public awareness mandates. For those of us that already have public awareness mandates, then it is an issue of robustly engaging in civic engagement activities, strong working relationships, strengthening whistleblower protection. For Malawi, when we are amending our statute last year, we added
Honorable Grace, I'll appreciate if you can wrap up. You've got almost a minute left, please. Thank you.
Okay, I'm actually on my last two slides. Thank you. So whistleblower protection, either in our mandates or broader whistleblower laws, use of ICT. This is an internet age, demanding creativity and innovation, and the continuous improvements of our advocacy. So for example, questioning ourselves, what are the trends telling us? Last year, we recorded 9,000 complaints on healthy issues alone. This is a signal that we must go systemic around the public health service delivery for Malawi. To conclude, therefore, it is imperative that as Ombuds institutions, we keep adapting, evolving, growing in strength and reputation to match the growing demands of our offices. And the effective advocacy will rest on independence, impartiality, fairness, objectivity, integrity, and transparency and responsiveness of our services. The more we demand from others, those MDAs, the public officials that we are oversighting, the more that will also be demanded from our services. So that's just part of our strong, effective enforcement mechanism, where Parliament is able to summon non-complying ministries, departments, and agencies to explain and provide accountability. And then out of those processes, you see that our Ministry of Health compliance rate with our determinations has risen, for example, to 89%. We'll stop there, and look forward to the further processes. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Honorable Malera. We appreciate that was insightful. Colleagues, we're not doing good with time. So what I will do really, if one can sum up what Honorable Malera has shared with us, is simply put, the future is one. We must continue to hold those that exercise public power, given our mandates and jurisdiction. That's just how I see it. And she assisted us with the how part of it: systemic investigations, mediation versus inquiring. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to labor anything anymore. What I will do now, our three speakers have spoken. We are now going to the last segment of my facilitation, the Q&A. Questions, live Q&A won't be taking place, as it has been indicated, because of time constraints. We have questions that were submitted in advance. So what I will do, our panelists are still in the room. Advocate Walters and Honorable Malera will help us with the questions. These questions I'll want you to share amongst yourselves. I'll want your response, Advocate Walters, on every question, and maybe your response as well, Advocate Malera, if you are persuaded to come in as well. The first question I have before me is the following. We only have one office of the Ombudsman located in our capital city, Honiara. We have no sub-offices located in the provinces for the last 43 years. Any thought of how we can ensure that the services of the Ombudsman go to the rest of Solomon Islands? Is there anyone, any take? Maybe we should start with you, Advocate Walters, given that you've been in the IOI and AORC, and here is a colleague saying for 43 years they couldn't succeed in getting the ombuds to offices or sub-offices in their area of jurisdiction and in their country. Your take in less than a minute, Advocate Walters, any wisdom, any insights you can share?
Thank you. As I said in my presentation, there's one of our successes to creating what we call regional offices. Namibia is an extremely vast land with sparsely a population, and that was necessary to create it. I will assist them, but I need to make an assessment, a needs assessment, and you need to know what is the population on each of the islands. How many islands are there? If I can get all the information, then I will help to draw for them a needs assessment and make some recommendations. Together with all the information, I would like to ask frankly to provide them with my email address, and then we can communicate directly with each other. I hope that will satisfy the colleague there in the Solomon Islands.
Thank you very much, Advocate Walters. What I will do now, I'll take the second question and give it straight to Honorable Malera in the interest of time. We're really behind. Here is a question for you, Honorable Malera. It goes as follows. I would appreciate if the facilitators could address the key processes of the Office of the Ombudsman that can implement to drive governance policies that improve public service delivery rather than focusing solely on remedial actions for individual complaints. I don't know if you've captured that, Honorable Malera. One colleague in our midst sent a question that he or she would appreciate if we could give them tangible ways of how they can implement, what ways they can use to implement to drive governance policies that improve public service delivery.
Thank you so much, Honorable Vusumuzi. So I think I had 1 or 2 slides in my presentation on how we can go beyond day-to-day complaints handling. And and then do our work in ways that we influence policy reforms, programmatic reforms. Number one is we need to increasingly become institutions that are looking at the complaints trends, paying attention to media reports, and picking issues where no matter how many complaints, individual complaints we are going to address, for as long as we are not going structural, then today you're addressing Mr. X's complaint, tomorrow it will be Mr. Z's complaint. So trends analysis is key. Then those trends should tell us how we can craft our systemic investigation. So either on our own volition, for those of us that have got mandates, or by being moved, and then going full throttle to address the root causes of some of the manifestations that we are seeing. As they say, stopping to treat the symptoms, but going to what is causing the problems. So systemic investigation is one of such important tool that we have, and it's there already inherent in our broad mandates. We do not have to wait for our statutes to be amended to mention the word systemic investigation. For as long as we have a broad mandate to investigate maladministration, we can go systemic. I've given examples on how through our systemic investigation, we have made a lot of directions and directives on policy reforms that should cascade later on into maybe law reform, and also rethinking on programs. So I would answer in that manner, and we are happy to share bilaterally to some of our colleagues on the work that we are doing around systemic investigations.
Thank you very much. I'll take the last one. This is for you, Advocate Walters. Is there a relationship between the law, politics, and human rights? If yes, what is the relationship? And what ought to be the relationship in the context of the scope of human rights and limitations? That's one last question. Then the other questions will be tackled and will be shared later. Advocate Walters.
It's a difficult question to answer, because it's so contrasting interests, politics, corruption, rule of law, whatever you say. The only relation is there must be a healthy relationship. And the relationship must be people oriented. If this is not people oriented, then you cannot assist the complainants with their complaints. You can see I struggle with my words, because it is difficult for me to just answer the question like that. But I think the best manner is for relationships to succeed is to be healthy relationship, and a relationship, not one which is contrasting or contradicting one another.
Thank you. Well done. I think that's very clear. Ladies and gentlemen, panelists, we are concluding now. It has been a very informative, a webinar. We really gained immense knowledge. But just as a parting shot, I'm gonna give you 1 minute, Advocate Walters, and 1 minute, Honorable Marera, just to wrap up your last and your final thoughts in less than a minute. Let's start with you, Honorable Malera, and then we'll ask Advocate 1 minute of his final thoughts.
Okay, thank you so much.
It could be less than a minute.
Yeah, it's been a privilege to share the stage with the esteemed panelists and share our reflections with colleagues. I think basically, when everything is said and done, we are advocates for the poor, for the voiceless, for the underprivileged. We are power blockers between them and the powerful. That's our governments, the decision makers. And the best way to go about it is to ensure that we remain independent, impartial, objective, and resolute in taking this mandate forward. And advocacy, people-centered advocacy, should be at the center of what we are doing. Thank you.
Awesome. Your final thoughts, Advocate Walters?
Yeah, I just want to wish the African Ombudsman Research Centre Godspeed, hope, strength on all their endeavors not to allow the Ombudsman institution everywhere, and especially in Africa, to become a historic monument through their engagement with all the Ombudsman officers, that it remain a living institution for the benefit of our people.
Thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you very much to all the attendees. We're wrapping up now. Just two things I want to say before I step down. One, there are more questions, but in the interest of time, I think there's 4 questions, but what we'll do, Marion will assist that the answers are provided to those questions by sharing them with the panelists. And in conclusion, the presentations will be shared as well in the manner that Marion will assist us as she wraps up and concludes. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It was indeed a very good webinar, so much enriching knowledge shared. I am sure we are empowered in many ways. Back to you, Marion, and thank you, and may you wrap up and conclude and dismiss us.
Thank you, Honorable Magwebu. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor on behalf of the African Ombudsman Research Centre to deliver this vote of thanks as we conclude today's Ombuds Day 2024 webinar. First, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to Dr. Sheetal Soni, who delivered the welcome address on behalf of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Your continued support from the academic community provides a strong foundation for the work that we do at AORC, and we are truly grateful for your participation today. We also extend our appreciation to Advocate Koleka Galeka, Public Protector of South Africa and Chairperson of the AORC Board, for your inspiring welcome address. Your leadership and commitment to strengthening ombudsman institutions across the continent continue to be invaluable in advancing the mission of AORC. Now, turning to our distinguished panelists. Mr. Chris Gill, thank you for your insightful presentation. Your discussion has significantly enriched our understanding of how ombudsman officers have evolved and their critical role in promoting justice, fairness, and accountability. Advocate John Walters, we are sincerely grateful for your presentation on the challenges and achievements of ombudsman officers. Your reflections on overcoming challenges, implementing best practices, and your idea of the Ombudsman institution as a living entity have reminded us of its adaptability and ongoing relevance in society. Your emphasis on the success of ombudsman institutions also highlighted their positive impact in advancing justice and fairness, something we can all take inspiration from. Honorable Grace Malera, thank you for your compelling discussion on the future directions and advocacy of for ombudsman institutions. Your perspective on the importance of independence, support, and advocacy strategies provides us with a much-needed roadmap for the continued growth and success of ombudsman institutions. An important point from Honorable Grace Malera, emphasizing that ombudsman institutions should not be antagonistic in their work, aligns with the core principles of fairness, impartiality, and the pursuit of justice. A very special thank you goes to Honorable Busumzi Magwebu, who's when the Ombudsman of Sierra Leone is unable to join us. Honorable Magwebu, your consistent support for AORC and your excellent facilitation, and we are truly grateful for your invaluable contribution. I would also like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Hazel Lange and the Corporate Relations